Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Lane Kiffin, Ole Miss, looking for a bounce back going on the road against the South Carolina team that not only is coming off a bye, but the vibe that I'm getting from this South Carolina program is there's a lot of confidence with this young talent coming together for South Carolina. Now, you go all the way back in terms of how we talked about South Carolina heading into 2024. This team has some players. Now the question is, does the young talent kind of come together and win football games in the SEC? Yeah, you had a really frustrating loss against LSU, but from what we've seen throughout the first four games this South Carolina team has played, there's a lot of confidence to be had within this program, specifically on the defensive side of the football. Want to get into, a few matchups, a few players, definitely address what we just saw from this Ole Miss offense against Kentucky on Saturday afternoon. Now, before we get into it, as always, just want to say thank you to you guys. These preview prediction episodes, they've been a blast for the boys. The amount of support y'all continue to show means the world. If you guys do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Much more importantly, let it fly in the comment section. Dill, a lot of different ways you can view this football game. One of the ways is this Ole Miss team is still really good. They just played a really bad game against Kentucky and kind of got caught sleepwalking. The other version of looking at it is that was the first time we saw Ole Miss play a real college football team. And I'm a Wake Forest alum. That's maybe a little shot at Wake Forest, but we ain't a real football team. And Ole Miss didn't look very good. And so you could also say, hey, Ole Miss hasn't really shown us they're a good football team yet. Then there's a lot of different ways you can view the South Carolina team as well. So let it fly in the comment section. Dill, we got to start with what we saw from the Ole Miss offense. I'll start. And it is, I spent all offseason long, the Ole Miss fans know this, talking about this offense, talking about how multidimensional this Ole Miss offense is and how impossible it can be to defend Ole Miss with all the different weapons you have on the football field and what you can do in the run game. The biggest concern I have coming out of that football game was it was a one-man show with Trey Harris. And look, I think Trey Harris is one of the best wide receivers, not only in the SEC, but in the country. But you cannot have an offense go through one player. Trey Harris had 15 targets in that football game. The next most targeted pass catcher was Henry Parrish at the running back spot with 5 targets. Juice Wells was a non-factor. Caden Prieskorn, a non-factor. I don't know what the purpose was in terms of what Lane Kiffin was doing the last 7 days in terms of game planning for Kentucky, but the game plan they came out with flat out stunk, and that was a problem for Ole Miss.
And the disappointing part is I don't think they got blown off the field up front. I thought for parts of that game, they did a pretty good job running the ball, frankly, which I was very surprised with. And then I think people are really getting on this Ole Miss offensive line a little too hard about the pass pro. That's a really good Kentucky defensive line. Obviously, Deone Walker leading the way, but guys like Weaver, Rybka, those are really, really good players. Ole Miss had enough time for the most part to make things happen. They just couldn't find anything to do other than try to push the ball down the field to Trey Harris or throw him in a couple of quick screens or whatever you want to call those plays. They didn't have anything unique to hit Kentucky with. I think that put them in a tough spot at times in this game. I think this offensive line, though, to me, honestly, acquitted themselves well enough to be a competitive unit in this SEC.
They ran the football actually quite well. The problem is they just didn't want to run the football. And that was so frustrating watching that game live, but then also watching it back this morning. Kentucky is light boxing you. They're having at some points 5 guys in the box. It is a hat on a hat. You can get the run game going. And when Ole Miss decided to run the football, it wasn't non-successful. I wouldn't say they ran all over Kentucky, but they had some success running the football, but never really stuck to it. I'll be a little bit more critical to pass protection, more because there were times when Kentucky only sent 3 dropped 8, and there were just muddy pockets, and you can't let that happen. If you're going to drop 8 and they're only going to pass rush 3, you have to give clean pockets. I think you can put some on Jackson Dart too. He just didn't manage pockets very well, dropping his eyes, trying to do too much. Just Jackson Dart never seemed settled in that football game.
That's part of it for me. I think the O-line's getting beat up a lot, and they weren't great. Obviously, that Kentucky team's hard to deal with. But Jackson Dart did not do them any favors in terms of what he was doing because he didn't manipulate the pocket at all. Anytime any pressure happened, you're right. Eyes immediately dropped, and he just started kind of running around almost aimlessly, it felt like.
And, are guys like Ulysses Bentley in, the doghouse or something? Because, he was my pick to lead this Ole Miss team in rushing yards Henry Parrish looks fine. Like, I'm not getting at Henry, but I just like if this Ole Miss team's going to run with pace and run so many plays, like, why aren't we keeping guys fresh and rotating guys and just using the talent that you have on this roster? You go out and get Amos in the transfer portal. He doesn't see the field. There were a lot of things that frustrated me about Ole Miss. Now, my last takeaway on the offensive side of the football is I still think this offense can be very good. Like, it is extremely talented. Multiple guys will be going to the NFL after this year. You just have to figure out what you want this Ole Miss offense to do. And I do trust Lane Kiffin to do just that. Like, he's proven time and time again, he's one of the better offensive minds in the country. Now, the problem is you're going up against a South Carolina defense on the road that I think is very, very good. And it starts with this pass rush. They're sacking the quarterback, 10% of dropbacks. That's 11th best in the country. And it comes from all over. Edge rushers are elite. Dylan Stewart is a true freshman. That's about as dominant of a defensive line true freshman in the SEC that I've seen in quite a long time. You look at the other side, you have guys like Brian Thomas, Kennard, Gilbert Edmond, TJ Sanders in the middle. This is an Ole Miss team that can get, or a South Carolina team, that can get after you in a lot of different ways. I'm looking for this Ole Miss offense to just deal with the pass rush much better than they did against Kentucky.
And that's my concern because, frankly, I think South Carolina can almost replicate that Kentucky performance. I don't think they're going to need to load the box necessarily to stop the run, mainly because the defensive tackles are playing better than I kind of thought they would against the run. I knew they were good pass rushers. They were good pass rushers last year. But them, combined with the fact that Kennard's really, really good against the run, and he makes a lot of plays from wherever he is, along with Dylan Stewart, I think they can kind of go to that like three-man look on the defensive line and just play kind of a zone that see if Jackson Dart has figured out how to kind of pick through that and find some openings and find some holes. Because it was like there was no one else to go. Or he never.
Well, yeah, what you're doing is looking at the film of Mark Stoops and saying, what did Mark Stoops do to give Jackson Dart so much problem and give Lane Kiffin so much problem? Because he was doing something. And I do think it was a lot of this, hey, we're going to not give up the big play and see if Ole Miss is patient enough to work the football down the field. And they just flat out weren't. I think Ole Miss for the first 4 games of the season were so used to just pushing the ball down the field, scoring in 2 minutes per drive, and kind of just running it up. And then when Kentucky said, hey, we're not going to let you push the ball down the field and hit explosive plays, we're going to make you kind of go methodically and earn it. It didn't seem like Ole Miss was very comfortable in doing so.
Now, the other side of that is South Carolina is going to need to try to be able to do what Kentucky was able to do on offense, and that's hold the ball for some really long drives. And Kentucky wasn't really moving it a ton on this Ole Miss team, but they had 2 or 3 or 4. I don't remember exactly how many, but a couple of drives that went well into over 6 minutes. In that shortening of the game, I think did put a lot of stress on that Ole Miss offense that's just not comfortable playing that slow, being off the field for that long. And then, you saw Jackson Dart start to really, really press. And that's like when we talk about the offensive line kind of breaking down a little bit, it's hard to differentiate those factors that Jackson Dart started to break down. They started to break down up front. I think a lot of that had to do with Kentucky's style of play as they just played a game that Ole Miss is really uncomfortable with. And then I wonder if South Carolina can replicate that offensive performance because that's where I think it gets hard given that South Carolina hasn't shown a great ability to sustain drives.
Well, you saw Ole Miss at times struggle with the Gavin Wimsatt package. That's what you're going to get. Like Lenore Sellers is going to be healthy. I think you're going to see, South Carolina right now running the football 65% of the time. That's top 10 in the country. Now, they're not running the football all that effectively quite yet, but you're starting to see it come on. Like Rocket, and especially coming off a bye, like Lenore Sellers is going to be as healthy as we've seen him. Rocket Sanders probably going to be as healthy as we've seen him. I think that matters for South Carolina because like what you said, that's what South Carolina is going to be trying to do. It's no secret what they want to do on offense. I don't really think they trust yet that pocket passing offense that's quite frankly just not how this offense is really constructed yet.
Yeah.
The Ole Miss defense.
Good.
The Ole Miss fans were like not happy with it. You had some problems in the secondary at times, and I don't think we were expecting Brock Vandegrift to be as productive as he was. One, give the former 5-star quarterback some credit. I thought he made some good throws, and there's difference makers on Kentucky's wide receiver room. Like Dane Key, Barry, and Brown, like those guys are electric factories. They can make plays, and they did make some plays to win that football game. Ole Miss had 5 sacks, 10 tackles for loss. They are still only allowing 2 yards per carry against the run. That is second best in the country. I left saying this Ole Miss defense looks different. It looks like a top end SEC defense.
They can get after you and create negative plays. That was the one thing I thought we really kind of struggled with at times last year was that ability to in bunches make a lot of negative
Yeah.
plays, getting a lot of sacks, getting them from different places. Perkins, Ivy, obviously Prince. Like they had a lot of guys from Walter Nolan. I thought had an amazing game. So
Yes.
their defensive line, their linebackers, I think are really playing the way you want them to play. And I mean, only a couple plays from that secondary and that big one to Barry and Brown. At the end of the day, that just can't happen in that situation. It's tough to see that he was one-on-one coverage out there. I don't know what defense they called, but that wasn't the right call, that's for sure. So aside from like that one play, I really thought for the most part, Ole Miss's defense did certainly enough for them to win that game.
Yeah, and at least and I think it's crazy because I think a lot of the Ole Miss fans, just because it's a loss, like you get frustrated with everything that went on. Like when I said this to you in the middle of the game, I was like, this Ole Miss defense, I think, is awfully impressive. And like if this Ole Miss offense can figure it out, like I think you have a defense that you can win at a very high level at in the SEC. And I think a couple of really tough matches for South Carolina in this football game. One, quarterbacks are getting sacked 15% of the time on dropbacks. It's 134th in the country. That's almost dead last in the FBS. It's getting better, but it is still a problem in pass protection. And then secondly, can South Carolina get the run game going against an Ole Miss defense that is allowing 1.5 yards per carry on the season? That's number 2 in the country. So there are things that I think do favor Ole Miss in this matchup that you're probably looking at. Dill, let's get into the pick here. And man, I'll just say this, like I'm thinking about just like going ghost and just flying down to watch this football game. Like it's my dream to watch a football game here in Willie Brice Stadium. I might do it, though. You might not hear from me till Sunday night.
I don't hate that.
9.5-point favorites for Ole Miss on the road here. Who you got?
I love the Rebels. I think people are
What?
way overreacting to that game. I mean, you watch that game. To me, I think Ole Miss certainly should have won it. Some really, really bad plays go against them. That fumble by Trey Harris just can't happen. And then that big 4th and 10, like that's just a very improbable play. Ole Miss was, I feel like, in control of that game for 99% of it. They were the better team. I think people are way overreacting. And at the end of the day, I just don't see how South Carolina moves the ball a whole lot. And I think Ole Miss, I'm a little scared to say it because it certainly burned you last week if you were just kind of putting some dying faith in Lane Kiffin and what they were doing on offense, because that's not a good enough plan. That's not a well-prepared team, I don't think. But I still think that's good offense. I'll go with Ole Miss.
You love Ole Miss. I don't know how you can love Ole Miss after that football game. I'm gonna go South. I'm catching 9.5 10 points now. For South Carolina at Williams-Brice Stadium. Dill, I still like this Ole Miss team. I think they very well could win this football game. I do like South Carolina. I like both of these teams. It's just hard for, and I think a lot of Ole Miss fans agree with me. It's just hard to bet on this Ole Miss team, especially with how good I think South Carolina's defense is. I don't think nearly enough people are talking about how good this defense is. We'll close it out there. You're on Ole Miss. I'm on South Carolina. This is going to be in an electric. I think South Carolina, this crowd is going to smell some blood in the water. I think it's going to be electric. Really fired up for this one again. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. We'll talk to y'all later.